Forugh composed about 130 poems that appeared in 5 volumes: Asir, Divar, Esyan, Tavallud Digar, and Iman Biavarim Baghaza Fasl Sard. From the first poems in 1954, in terms of content, in terms of point of view, the poems were modernist. You can look up the word modernism in literature. It's actually the Britannica article is particularly good in English. Modernism was a universal phenomenon. It took place in Iran in the 1920s and 30s. And if some of the inspiration for it taking place in Iran was Western literature, so be it. Literature is not a matter of borrowing or stealing or things belonging to one group or another group. It's in the air, so to speak. And in the air from the end of the 19th century in Europe and in other places for other reasons, there was a sense that the answers we got from the past were not serving us well. And the questions we had in the past, for which there were answers in the past, were not the questions we wanted to ask now. In the case of English literature, Darwin's Origin of Species, works by Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud's works in psychology, all played a part in people beginning to think that the world of belief, the world of religious faith, formal religion wasn't as satisfying as it used to be. People began thinking that the world of nature, which was the center of the universe in art previously, was being replaced by the city as the subject of art, and city life was replacing life with gardens and trees and countryside and what have you. And then a cataclysmic event happened. In the West, intellectuals and artists, people who read a lot and traveled some, thought that however awful the world was in general, we could count on the West as the preserver of civilization. And in fact, several governments, imperialistic governments, America enters onto the scene at the very end of all this, thought that if they could just export Western values to the rest of the world would get better. And then what happened? 1 out of 9 men in Europe died in World War I. And World War I was reported on with photographs, with poems, with reports, with films, unlike any previous war, and nobody could think that war was honorable. Nobody could think that the daily business of world war was humane, especially when in Europe, cousins were killing one another. That is, the French were killing the Germans, the English were getting killed and killing. And this raised really serious questions for people who are involved in art, in writing, literature in particular. And this caused the phenomenon we call modernism. It's not a school, it's not an organized group, it's kind of a general approach that doesn't look at the past the same way, that asks different questions, that doesn't necessarily expect there to be answers, expects there may end up being more questions. As significant as that, and in case of Forugh, more important than that, she is almost first generation, this part of modernism. At the same time, the speaker, the narrator, is no longer a representative of a group. There is an avant-garde, that is people who think of themselves as a little bit in front of other people. It's like the situation where in a military operation in the western part of the United States, they'd have 2 or 3 people as scouts who would go out and go to the top of the hill, look what's on the other side. And they'd come back and tell you, there's the whole army, what was on the other side. And some people would say, I don't believe them, that there's this danger on the other side. Let's just move forward. Some people would believe them. I'm not arguing whether the scouts told the truth or not, but there were this group of people in the arts who had this view with respect to their role. They didn't represent. Remember, Hafez is a representative. Sadi is a representative. Maulana is a representative. Nimayushi is not a representative. Sadeh Hidayat is not a representative. Ghulam Hussain Saadi is not a representative. And especially Forugh is not a representative because she took an extra step from the very beginning. She didn't wear a mask. When she presents things that are personal in her text, we don't have to think of them as necessarily autobiographical, but she is, the characters, the speakers are frank and open, and she presents things in the world of art in what was very unusual in Persian literature. However, as Dr. Dilshad mentioned at the beginning, he got to the last slide in this series. Of these 128, 130 poems she composed in 5 volumes, 60 of them, 61 or 62 of them, are composed in quatrain sequence forms with rhyme schemes, with aruz, metrical patterns. In other words, in terms of form, they were what she inherited. And why wouldn't a young poet, male or female, in the early 1940s or mid 1940s, start by inheriting the customs of the past, the traditions of the past? But from the very beginning, since her content didn't match what the forms were, we had the feeling that she was probably searching for her own forms. And we discover one poem maybe in Asir, 4 or 5 poems in Divar, several poems in Essian have forms that seem to be determined by content. As of Tavlur Digar, the 35 poems in that collection, and Iman Biawarim Baraz Fasl Sard, the 7 poems in that collection, there are no more quatrain sequence poems. That is, we can surmise that she got comfortable with having her inspiration get onto paper and assume the form that what she had in mind or how she felt about things determined. For me, the minute I got, years ago, I got a copy of the first edition of Divar, I said to myself, this is evidence for where she was, because all of the illustrations in Divar are wholeheartedly modernist. The poems are modernist in the content, but not modernist in form. But what's interesting about the drawings and paintings, they're specifically modernist in form. And what I want us to do, we don't have time, is just kind of go through and look at them and stop and think of what the difference is in this representation. Is it a world of fiction, a Yekibud, Yekinabud world? No. Is it a world like Sevrugin in his photographs, Kamal al-Mulk in his paintings? Is it a realistic world? No. It's a reality, but it's that parallel reality that I keep mentioning of the Vaghiyat, Alama Vaghiyat Honari, of the reality of an artistic world, which is not a made-up world. It's just a separate world, satisfying for us when we're enjoying art, not satisfying for answers to practical problems in life, just as real life may be satisfying if we solve the problems in real life, but real life is not satisfying in artistic terms, so to speak, in aesthetic terms. Anyway, Mariam, if you just kind of go through the slides and just stop and think, there are going to be windows, doors, trees, human figures, and something is going on that takes them out of the world, a little bit slower. Something's going on that takes them about, it takes them out of the world of reality, but not a world of fiction. And they have that other ingredient that we're going to find much more in her poetry goes along. They're all suggestive. There's more there than we can verbalize. I think I mentioned in passing in symbolist poetry in France, some of the poetry gives you an object and presents it as a symbol, but it really is there to suggest a symbol. There's no symbol that the poet had in mind. It's just that the poet thinks, as when we see a beautiful mountain or a sunset or whatever, we think there's more meaning. We can't define it. there may not be more meaning, but we just have the feeling of some kind of connection with something more than meets the eye. And we've had poems that have windows and doors and thresholds and such. And in each of these cases, the slideshow that I have for the whole thing has each of the poems and a translation of the poems and further commentary. I'll put it on issue.com at some point. Here they're just the slides. And here we have the slide for Obtani, the previous one. The one with the reclining figure. We have to decide if it matches closely what's going on in the poem. I don't know that Forugh talked a lot with the artist about that, but I will get to that in a minute. Mm-hmm.
آقای دکتر این چی؟ این sacrifice رو اینجا نفهمیدم.
That's the name of the poem.
مال poem, okay.
That is, I have the illustrations accompany a particular poem. I don't have the poem here. I don't have the translation here. And then we have Brother Jim's commentary of what he got out of it as somebody who likes modernist art.
Okay.
So three or four things. They're not traditional. They're not definable. They're appealing. They're balanced and what have you. The way they're centered on the page. They're suggestive. It's not a made-up cartoon world or a world of an afsane kind of world, but something is going on that is more modern than Sohrab Seferi, more modern than I can't remember Kalantari's first name. Hassan Kalantari? Parviz
Kalantari.
Parviz Kalantari. Sun, moon, mountains, rivers, female figures. And we have to remember in art, in world art in general, I'm not so sure this has been true traditionally in Persian art. In world art in general, the contours of the female body have kind of paralleled contours in nature. And we see some of that in some of these slides. I would also ask you to imagine, so you can imagine the realism in Kamal al-Mulk or the realism in other painters you may be familiar with. Then imagine what came before that, miniature paintings, which didn't have a third dimension on purpose, which had items that were farther away, were just higher up in the painting, not farther away in our field of vision. So the tradition is very different from this, but she's also, or the painter, the designer is also far from the realistic tradition, which was contemporary in the late 19th century. By the way, modern means some of the stuff I've been suggesting, whereas contemporary just has to do with time. Contemporary means the present period. Modern could be 100 years ago, or it could be 10 years from now. Also, we have to bear in mind, most of us live in a realistic world. Even though modernism happened 100 years ago, most people when they read novels, most people when they look at paintings, most people when they read poetry, like the world that they're seeing to be a mimetic world, a world that kind of represents the world they live in. That's neither good nor bad, that's taste. But modernism has come onto the scene, and I don't know what those of you who have lived in Iran in recent years think. In Iran, with respect to poetry and art, are half of the viewers as comfortable with things that are modern as they are with things that are traditional, realistic? My impression that still maybe not half. That is, people are more comfortable with the shape of traditional Persian poems, with the imagery, the generalized images rather than specific images, and with the with the less frank, less open, less down-to-earth sorts of representation. This is neither good nor bad, but it just seems to be that sort of thing. In America, we could say people have bought into modern, but they drew the line, surprisingly, paradoxically, or ironically rather than paradoxically, ironically, with the most American expression in art there is, which is abstract expressionism. That is the one thing that America did with modern art was abstract expressionism. You get personal feeling, but you can't connect it with any objects you know from outside the painting because you don't see those objects in the painting. And we hear all the time, we go to museum, people saying, what's that about? What's the subject of the painting? That is, they're not ready to let go to that last thing which connects the painting to that real world. I'm not criticizing them, it's just a matter of taste. Anyway, that's enough for this. Let's go to the beginning of the Another Birth slides, where we got 2 pages on the poem left from last time on Tanya. Notice that Mariam Sadiqi's training in Persian literature in Iran is really helping in her new career as a studio engineer. Nobody's smiling. Good. If somebody would read that poem for us, please.
بهار بخون.
من میتونم بخونم اگرشون.
حتما.
شعر آبتنی. لخت شدم تا در آن هوای دلانگیز پیکر خود را به آب چشمه بشویم. وسوسه میریخت در دلم شب خاموش تا غم دل را به گوش چشمه بگویم. آب خنک بود و موجهای درخشان ناله کنان گرد من به شوق خزیدم. گویی با دستهای نرم و بلورین جان و تنم را به سوی خویش کشیدند. بادی از آن دورها وزید و شتابان دامنی از گل به روی گیسوی من میریخت. عطر دلاویز و
تنده
دلاویز و تنده
پونه وحشی
یعنی که اضافه هست تا آخر ها؟
از نفس باد در مشام من آویخت. چشم فرو بستم و خاموش و سبکرو تن به علفهای نرم و تازه فشردم. همچو
زنی کو قنوده در بر معشوق.
همچو زنی کو قنوده در بر معشوق یک سر خود را به دست چشمه سپردم. روی دو ساقم لبان مرتعش آب بوس زن و بیقرار و تشنه و تبدار ناگه در هم خزید راضی و سرمست. جسم من و روح چشم سار گناهکار.
مرسی. البته میشه بهتره که مکس نکنیم پس از مصرع سوم. راضی و سرمست جسم من و روح چشم سار گناهکار. یعنی ما اینطوری بودیم بعد از این. بسیار خوب. حالا وزن عروضی. بله، سیلاب اول لخت، short syllable followed by 2 consonants. بعد یک سیلاب کوتاه حساب میشه چون سیلاب overlonge، یعنی از نظر حساب مقررات عروضی. لخت شدم long short short long تا آخر اونطوریه. بنابراین از نظر فرم و writ, it is traditional. As for its rhyme scheme, it is A, B, C, B. The second and fourth lines rhyme. Beshuyam, beguyam, chazidan, keshidan, miricht, avicht, feshordam, supportam. And the reason why I read those out loud is that in the first four stanza, they're the strongest words in the line. So the fact of the rhyme is adding to the emphasis of action. That is, even though when we think of somebody reclining at the beach and maybe having his or her legs in the water, we don't think of that as a very active, aggressively active sort of situation. But these verbs tell us that there's something very active going on. And then what happens in the final stanza? Tabdaro gonahkar. We then have adjectives. This is a little touch. We don't care if it's deliberate or not, but it has an effect because the scene sort of changes. It becomes static at the end, or let's say there's something frenetic or moving towards something in the first four stanzas, and we're now at the state that's achieved by what's gone on in the first four stanzas. So the adjectives sort of take over. We notice, and in the reading, we sort of paused over a couple of these. There are instances of poetic license. Number 4 there is Zawrat al-Sheri, Khamush, Ku, Ke'u, or the Ku, Ke'u with a aleph there in the 4th stanza, Ke'u, Ku, and Gonahkar instead of Gonahkar. We're not thinking of it as a flaw. We just recognize, as was the case in English poetry to the 20th century, if you really wanted a rhyme for reasons other than decoration, although decoration is fine, for reasons other than decoration, you had the license, you had the right to change word order to achieve that. Now, in the case of English, it's a lot more artificial, because when you put the subject before the verb, you actually have caused the sentence to be unnatural. Whereas we know in Persian, even though neutral order is subject, object, verb, we can move the parts around depending upon what we're emphasizing. Then we have the issue of forms of instances of tekrar, of repetition of things. And I've argued that I don't generalize about Forugh, but Forugh's poetic imagination builds on what she said in one stanza and often enough repeats something or moves on for that. And I argue that the simple repetition of something makes the thing more familiar and more agreeable to readers when it happens the second, third, and fourth time. And at the same time, it seems like it's incremental. The second time you heard the word window in Panjare, you thought a little bit more about window. Window was a little bit more than it was the first time. Third, fourth, fifth, the same way. So here we have these 4 instances of del in compound words or in phrases. Del, John, Tan. We have a harmony of some sorts of images. He's describing something that is a personal experience, and we assume in a lyric poem, when a poet describes something that's a personal experience, we don't care if it happened in reality, if it had a different reality, or it happened in our imagination. It's poetic, it's artistic reality. We assume that what she expects is for us to momentarily share in that experience, to get in that mood, and then to move along and have the aesthetic pleasure of momentarily having an experience, not just observing it, but kind of getting involved in the same experience and moving onward. And isn't that the way, it's not a very important literary work, but isn't that the way life often works? That is, you hear about something, see a movie about something, read a short story about something, In my case, it's happened that after 10 or 15 years of reading particular novels, I forget that the characters in novels I really don't know in real life. That is, in my mind, they're as alive and three-dimensional as people in life. Well, now we have to ask you, what is the event that's described here? Let's go to the next page.
آقای دکتر
Uh-huh.
این کاغذاتونه که اونجا کنار کامپیوتر چه جا به جا میکنه، یعنی صداش مثل جنگ ایران و تورانه. خیلی
بالاخره ایران اونو برده، نه؟
آره بابا، ایران همیشه برده.
به چه قیمتی؟
به قیمت یک عالمه جنگ.
و بعد میرسیم به
سهراب
فراخزاد.
آره
میبخشیم. خب صفحه دوم. هویت گوینده. Anything special about the person or personhood of the speaker? Male, female, young, old?
We can say female, and I don't see any clues for the age, but from the passion and sensuality, maybe we can infer that she is young.
Younger, or let's assume somebody who's vital, somebody's alive in all regards. Chronological age is not important, but we all know people, when they get to be middle-aged, they act middle-aged. My parents were like that. When they got old, they acted old. Whereas some of us just kind of act the way our bodies and energy and what have you allow us to, no matter what our age is. Do you have any evidence that she's a woman?
بله.
Where is that?
دامن انگیسو.
Good. And همچو زنی کو قنوده در بر معشوق. It may in one sense be a circumstance, that is, but since she is a woman, and there may be something about how females are involved in intimate love situations that might distinguish them from males. Let me put it this way. There may be a kind of sense that in physical terms, women are on the receiving end sometimes in physical sexual relationships. One side or the other is not more or less significant or meaningful, but there may be some sort of general impression of a difference there. So a woman who is vital.
معلومه که زن، الان فکر می‌کردم خودشه، ولی معلومه که زنه. کدوم مردی میره توی آب حس کنه که آب داره بوسه میزنه به ساقه پاش؟ من اولین بار همچین چیزی رو حس میکنم اصلا و من میگم مای گاد چقدر عقبم.
عقب و جلو که نداره.
نه یعنی اینجوری بتونه آدم به دور و برش نگاه کنه، بتونه حس داشته باشه.
Maybe there wasn't water all over the place in Iran, but for sure boys and girls, either together or separately, in lots of rural places in the United States, we used to go skinny dipping, used to go swimming without any clothes, and it didn't make any difference whether they were male or female. The feeling of being in the water without any clothes was a physical feeling that was different from swimming in a bathing suit or otherwise. I agree with what you're saying, but it's possible men could have a similar sort of sensual experience in this situation. But yes, yeah, we all agree. A woman. In formalist terms, do we now think that there's anything appropriate or inappropriate about what she's revealing? And by formalist terms, I mean, we assume this text is by itself, it's independent, and we have this person describing a situation. We have no evidence to suggest that there's anything untoward or inappropriate about it. But you plop this poem down into Tehran in 1955 or 56, and some people are going to get upset. A lot of people are going to get upset. And if we decide, and I haven't made up my mind in this regard, it's not all that important. If we decide that there is a sexual event here, and that the satisfaction and release has to do with that sexual event, that can be doubly upsetting to part of the reading population, the male population, because it implies that there is a self-sufficiency in human beings, including females, that makes it unnecessary for males to be part of the equation. Although males themselves think of themselves as being independent and self-sufficient in general, they have this traditional notion that women get completed in life by being male. The guy in Halqeh was not some crazy older Iranian man. He was just surprised that a young girl would ask about the meaning of wedding ring. That is, he was now going to be supporting her for the rest of her life. It was her aim in life, or was supposed to be her aim in life, that she was to get married and be a wife and mother. So he put it in a context, and there as well, in an American context, it might also be discomforting to males. In any case, هویت گوینده، تصویر سازی، the images are still, they're not generic, they're specific. Arms, legs, heart, hair, what have you. But they're not described in such terms that you would recognize the woman somewhere, or described in such terms you recognize the physical setting. Now we have to, the question that comes to mind right away, in her interaction with the spring, has personification taken place? That is, does the spring become alive in a human sort of way?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Go ahead. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about. Sorry about that. I have a question about that. Why does she use the adjective گناهکار
Very
to
good.
describe the چشمه?
Have you all read Forug's poem called Gonah? There's another, her most famous poem is Gonah. If you haven't read the poem Gonah, we're going to see in that poem, she describes a sex act with a man, obviously not her husband, in the privacy of some place, not scandalizing anybody else, two consenting adults. Again, for our money today, that was her own business. Making a poem of it was going to be risky, and it turned out to be very risky. And in the poem, she, in two places, she calls it a sin. And in a couple of places, she wonders, oh, God knows what I did. When I read that poem, I say she calls it a sin because society calls it a sin. But when I read the poem, I don't know where the sin is, which means without criticizing society, she uses society's words that the text doesn't live up to. As for her saying in that poem that God knows what I did, the God knows, we have that kind of expression in Persian and in English, can be cultural in the sense that I grew up believing in a particular religious faith, particular rules about morality. And if I can imagine a God, I'm not doing things the way I was supposed to do. But it may also just be, who knows what I did? I just did it. I had instincts. I did it. We readers say that was okay. Publishing the poem, you're going to face risks. She did. It was very upsetting and such. So the question is a very good question. Gonahkar seems to imply that if this was sexual, the spring is being sinful in having an illicit relationship or participating in a relationship which is outside of marriage. We don't have to do anything more than that. If there is a norm and she's not behaving toward the norm, and a factor in it is the behavior, so to speak, the personified behavior of the spring, then gonahkar is sort of a recognition of the context in which such a poem got composed. When I first read the poem, I said to myself, now suppose I had read this poem in the 1950s or 1960s, and it was an American poem. Would I have immediately imagined society wouldn't have approved, and therefore if the sunset caused me to engage physically, sexually with somebody, or the night breeze, or the ocean waves, would I have attributed some sinfulness to a character? Before that, however, we have the word vasvase in the second stanza, which implies the temptation. Temptation usually implies in our everyday conversation, you say, I was tempted to eat that. Well, there we're just saying, I shouldn't have so much sugar, I've got to watch my weight, or it's not so healthy. But this vasvase sort of implies that nature can tempt you to behave in a way that may be natural in nature, but for human beings to behave that way, there's an issue. Now, what are we doing? Kind of talking around everything. We're just suggesting the suggestiveness of this poem. That it's kind of rich in what it brings to mind ultimately. Yes, there is shakhsiyat bakhshi for sure. Eshq ashiq mashugh is ab cheshme mashugh guyande, in a sense, yes. By the way, in most of Hafez, whether or not the beloved is a male or female, and I don't know why some Orientalist critics insist upon every Hafezian mashugh being a male. I treat Hafez the way I treat other poems. If there is peach fuzz, there's a little beard on the beloved's face, okay, it's a younger male. Otherwise, I just imagine what I want to imagine in terms of the identity, gender identity of lover and beloved. That's another issue. In any case, very rarely in Hafez are we invited to imagine the physical activity. And there's nothing the matter with that. We saw it in Joft, but Hafez doesn't operate that way. He doesn't go like movies used to, fade out when the two people are together at a hotel room or their own bedroom, and then suddenly you have the next morning an alarm clock or sunrise. He actually talks about union, but it's left to our own imagination, and we're not really invited to imagine the specific physical activity. We have to decide here, what is the physical activity? Are we asked to imagine it or not? But in general, we can say they are playing those roles.
ببخشید. همونجور که گفتین یه جورایی میشه گفت اصلا این چشمه همون معشوقش، همون بیلاوید که شما الان داشتین میگفت. بعد سیگنیفیکنسی هست با لغت چشمه، اینقدر لغت شین دیده میشه تو این شعرش یا همین جوریه؟
Does anybody know offhand how many sheens there are in the poem? 21. And what sheen remind you of? Shorter shore? That is, and I don't know the answer to this question. Remember that in English, dogs go woof woof, or anyway, in Persian, dogs can say qain, valk valk, hup hup. So onomatopoeia is different in different languages. Can a predominance of sheens bring to your ear a feeling of water coming towards someone. I'm asking, I don't know the answer to the question in Persian, for your Persian ears, but it was instinctive for her to have 21 occasions in 5 stanzas of the sound sheen. If that's the case, if it does make that kind of, it does resonate that way, that reminds us that in terms of form, everything that a language can do is going to be brought to bear in a poem so that we get a fullness of the effect that words denotations and connotations and associations have. And that, I think, is a possible effect here. We talked, and I've suggested number 5, that there may be a comparison, a similarity between Ob Tani here and Walt Whitman's Song of Myself in the latter years. The last edition was 1892, a classic poem by Walt Whitman, an early modernist American poet. He has this poem in 40-some sections. It's 40 or 50 pages long. And in the poem, he equates body and soul. Soul is important. Body is just as important. He equates thinking about things and even masturbation as being equal. That is, anything that makes life more intense, he equates without judgment. What's more interesting for us, in one regard, is that the poem has no rhyme scheme and no meter. But we have a poem that has no rhyme scheme and no meter, but the poem is going to use the capacity of language in a full way. It'll do other things that achieve the same effects as poetry and meter. And if I can make a slight digression here, there are plenty of translations of Forugh, and most of the people who translate Forugh, when they treat one of her poems that's quatrain sequence, they use free verse, no rhyme and no meter. And then when they translate a poem of Forugh that doesn't have any rhyme or meter, they translate it the same way. My question is this: if Forugh uses rhyme and meter and it achieves effects Y and Z, wouldn't the translator have to do something in his or her version that would achieve Y1 and Z1, rather than free verse, which maybe doesn't achieve either of those? I don't know what the translator can do, but some translators translate, and they say they're engaging in poetry. They treat her different poems as if they had the same forms. In any case, so what Walt Whitman does is he piles on the images so that they themselves start having a rhythm of their own. He might use 10 adjectives breathlessly, one after the other. He takes a particular route. Not many poets have continued that route, but it's successful. When you finish reading the poem, you feel the same as if you had read 20 Hafizian ghazals in a row, each of which was very tightly structured in terms of music and rhyme. Number 6, the sinfulness of the spring we thought about. Do the speaker and the spring have sex? I don't think it matters. That is when we have personification and we have this sort of imagery, it's intimacy that counts. That is, her feeling is of a kind of self-satisfaction, or self-sufficiency and satisfaction being in its natural environment. And for sure, on days of which I've kayaked for a couple of hours or sailed for a couple of hours or skied all morning, when I finish, it's total satisfaction. I'm in a zone while it's happening, total satisfaction. And I don't analyze it in terms of exactly what it was that contributed to it. So I don't think we have to define the exact physical sensations or what caused physical sensations. This is the state she felt as a result of this experience. Could a person naked on a beach feel that the wind was caressing him or her? Could they feel that the waves coming in very softly were caressing him or her? Could they feel that the reeds or whatever we call grass that comes up out of the water, that they were kind of caressing? For sure. In the same way, you might feel if somebody combs your hair, kind of caressing. We don't have to pursue it in a sense, except for what has happened here. There seem to be no masks. It's wholeheartedly modern, and it gives us an experience that what the communicated experience is. If you're open, if your body and your soul are open to receiving what's outside, you can have moments where you are razi and metaphorically intoxicated. And it won't just be your body, جسم و روح و جسم من و روح چشم سار گناهکار. Any comments? Do we want to be a little bit more specific about the communicated experience? Are there any lessons in this poem? That's one other thing I forgot to mention. Modernism rarely has lessons. They have, since they don't have answers, what they're going to describe is moments that they are finding meaningful, significant, but they might not tell us what to do with them. Whereas just think about Hafez, Sa'di, Maulana, traditional poets in general, poets of the Constitutional Revolution, Parveen Ettisami, Simin Behbahani, Tahir Safar Sadeh. We think of Ahmad Shamlu. We think of poets often having a lesson along with other things. Those lessons are probably less modern than the rest of what they might do that we might call modern. I think of this as a very effective poem, even though I can't define it when I'm finished with it the way you could define Joft or Jomeh or a couple of, or Naderpur's Qom. I haven't read the book up there on the left by Saye Ektasadi Nia, but I heard her talk at a conference on Abtani, a very appealing talk. I haven't been able to locate the book. So if you could put in the back of your mind, if you kind of like this poem and the idea, the imagery behind it, you might take a look at what she's written about it. If there are any other comments, let's move on to Forough Saad's Tanada Digar. These are the 35 poems in Another Birth. Why don't we move on to this slide here, 5.5, and then if we've been able to upload the Forough Saad's recording of the poem, we'll listen to that. If not, Mariam Saad, if he has agreed, she'll read it. Can you get back to the very first?
صدا میاد اصلا؟
صدا
Okay,
میاد.
okay.
Everybody, did we get the sound?
همه هستی من آیه تاریکی است که تو را در خود تکرار کنان به سحرگاه شگفتنها و رستنهای ابدی خواهد برد. من در این آیه تو را آشیدم آه، من در این آیه تو را به درخت و آب و آتش پیوند زدم. زندگی شاید یک خیابان دراز است که هر روز زنی با زنبیلی از آن می‌گذرد. زندگی شاید ریسمانی است که مردی با آن خود را از شاخه می‌آویزد. زندگی شاید طفلی است که از مدرسه برمیگردد. زندگی شاید عبور گیج رهگذری باشد که کلاه از سر برمی‌دارد و به یک رهگذر دیگر با لبخندی بی معنی میگوید صبح بخیر. زندگی شاید آن لحظه مسدودی است که نگاه من در نیمی چشمان تو خود را ویران میسازد و در این حسی است که من آن را با ادراک ماه و با دریافت ظلمت خواهم آمیخت. در اتاقی که به اندازه یک تنهایی است، دل من که به اندازه یک عشق است به بهانه‌های ساده خوشبختی خود می‌نگرد، به زوال زیبای گلها در گلدان، به نهالی که تو در باغچه خانه من کاشته ای و به آواز قناری‌ها که به اندازه یک پنجره می‌خوانند. آه، سهم من این است، سهم من این است، سهم من آسمانی است که آویختن پرده آن را از من میگیرد. سهم من پایین رفتن از یک پله متروک است و به چیزی در پوسیدگی و غربت واصل گشتن. سهم من گردش حزن‌آلودی در باغ خاطره هاست و در اندوه صدایی جان دادن که به من میگوید دستهایت را دوست می‌دارم. دستهایم را در باغچه می‌کارم، سبز خواهم شد، میدانم و پرستوها در گودی انگشتان جوهریم تخم خواهند گذاشت. گوشواری به دو گوشم می‌آویزم از دو گیلاس سرخ همزاد و به ناخن‌هایم برگ گل کوکب می‌چسبانم. کوچه‌ای هست که در آنجا پسرانی که به من عاشق بودند هنوز با همان موهای درهم و گردنهای باریک و پاهای لاغر به تبسمهای معصوم دخترکی می اندیشند که یک شب او را باد با خود برد. کوچه‌ای هست که قلب من آن را از محله‌های کودکیم دزدیده است. سفر حجمی در خط زمان و به حجمی خط خشک زمان را آبستن کردند. حجمی از تصویری آگاه که ز مهمانی یک آینه برمیگردد و بدین سان است که کسی میمیرد و کسی میماند. هیچ صیادی در جوی حقیری که به گودالی میریزد مرواریدی صید نخواهد کرد. من پری کوچک غمگینی را میشناسم که در اقیانوسی مسکن دارد و دلش را در یک نیلبک چوبین مینوازد آرام آرام. پری کوچک غمگینی که شب از یک بوسه میمیرد و سحرگاه از یک بوسه به دنیا خواهد آمد.
In my version of the PowerPoint on pages 5.6 and 5.7, we have the first instance of the text. What's our immediate impression? The next page, the next two pages, that page and the next page. Let's start with tone. Happy, enthusiastic, energetic, dynamic. Are those adjectives going to work?
Sad.
Okay, sad.
I think it's all of them together she described in different stages. Like,
But where is she happy?
when she has hope for better future and better opening, better better environment that she can show herself the way she is without any shame.
Where is that in the poem?
Probably sometime in future.
No, in the poem.
Oh, in the poem. Okay.
Mariam, can you flip the next page to pages 5 and pages 6 and pages 7?
When she says that born again, مثلا به دنیا می آید سحر.
من پری کوچک غمگینی را میشناسم که در اقیانوسی مسکن دارد و دلش را در یک نیلبک چوبین می نوازد آرام آرام. Do we assume that this پری کوچک is playing happy music in these lines?
No.
Okay, because it's غمگین. And this پری کوچک غمگین، پری کوچک غمگینی که شب از یک بوسه میمیرد و سحرگاه از یک بوسه به دنیا خواهد آمد. Does به دنیا خواهد آمد tell us that she is going to be happy or that she's just going to come into the world again?
Hopeful. She's hopeful.
Does it tell us
I don't
hopeful?
see any hope. I don't.
It's not without hope. It just
No.
it seems in terms of the vocabulary, I think we have to say it's neutral. That is, it's as if she's dying at night, and with a kiss, she's coming back to the world in the morning.
She get another opportunity to.
But what has she said her lot in life is to do?
I don't see any opportunity here. It's like, تکرار همون غمگینی و
But what did she literally say her lot in life is to be or to do? It's in on the first page.
But on line 40 you can see the hope. دستهایم رو
میکارم دقیقاً.
و نمیدونم پرنده ها تخم میگذارن از نوشتنهای من.
But what is let's get back to that in just a second. What has she said her whole life is? That is سهم اون چیه؟ سهم من پایین رفتن از یک پله متروک است، سطر 32، و به چیزی در پوسیدگی غربت واصل گشتن. سهم من گردش حزن‌آلودی در باغ خاطره هاست. And when we get to the lines you just quoted, interesting lines, those lines are a memory she has, not the life that she has. That is, when she was a girl, she did what? Her mother wouldn't let her wear her real earrings, so she'd find twin cherries, that is, cherries that had one little stem with two, and put them over her ears. And then she would wet flower petals and put them on her fingernails. And at another time in childhood, she, in a childlike way, would put her hands in the earth and think that things would grow out of them. So she has set up early in the poem what she says life is, and then she says what her life is. And her life is a matter of having memories of the past. Those memories may be satisfying, but she hasn't told us how she feels about the present, and doesn't really tell us what she feels about the future. That is, for a second, in one regard, we have to put aside what we know about her life and just look at this poem, and what it says would be the basis of what we think. In the same breath that I say that, I'm going to now gloss it in a different way. The last lines that we talked about, the Pari Kuchek, if I read this poem autobiographically, and there are several reasons why people do it, I'm going to say that little sad fairy is who? That's herself. And her life is what? She's the other woman she lives in a house up the street from the house where Golestan lives with his wife, which means her life is reversed. He can be with her during the day. He can say he's at the office or whatever, but he goes home at night. So he kisses her goodnight. I'm not saying this is in the poem. I'm saying if I'm thinking autobiographically, I might have this thought. He goes home at night, and she loves him. It's if she's dead now. And when he comes back the next morning, when he can leave the house, she comes back to life again. But we don't know if that life, she's in love, but we don't, that is autobiographically speaking. I'm not saying we should do it. I'm saying it's there for people who are interested just to think about the possibility. It's even people like Hafez say, it's better to be miserable in love than not to be in love. She's got to have Golestan in his life, even though he's a jerk, or whatever technical word you want to use to describe his behavior when they were together or later. In any case, her reading of the poem, there's nostalgia, as one of you said, there's sadness, there's, I don't know if we'd call it regret, if there's a kind of questioning, there's a kind of a lament of, instead of being optimistic, I think she knows that this kind of life isn't satisfying, except in one way that I'll get to in a minute. But this is better than any other kind of life she'd have. I mean, there are people, I fortunately I've never been one of them, who just think that they've got to put up with life, that life is not a bowl of cherries, is it? Or a bowl of Cheerios, or whatever it is in the morning people want to eat. And I would say in general, the poems that follow this poem in her career are poems where if there's happiness, there's kind of aggressive happiness. Says, I'm going to do it whether you like it or not, and I'm happy. Wouldn't somebody be more happy if they just did what they liked and didn't think about it being something they have to defend themselves doing? She says in her last poem. Why should I stop doing what I'm doing? Another poem, Fatabal, she talks about, I don't care what people say about us. Us being together is the important thing. So her tone, I think, comes across in the reading. I don't see any change in the tone throughout the poem when she's talking about what she says life means, when she goes to her memories, and then when he has that section at the end about what a full life is in this small fairy. I think the tone sort of stays the same. And let's kind of put that in our mind as a first impression. That it's a wonderful poem. She should be happy she composed it, but she may have composed it not being happy, so to speak, or it may reflect something that's a little bit less than happiness. If we could go back to the first page of Pavlodiga, I think it's number 5.5. Page 7, the dedication of the volume, 1964, Be Aleph Gof, Be Ibrahim Golestan. That is, she dedicates the whole volume to Golestan, and that can account for some people having a first impression that it is that we can take this poem, the title poem, as being autobiographical, and that her other birth is her coming alive again in the aftermath of how she was treated by Nasser Khudayar and the intelligentsia, part of the crowd of poets and writers, and her mental issues and what have you. I say let's know everything in the poem that could be autobiographical and then make up our minds if the experience she's communicating is the experience of Forugh or the experience of a speaker who gives us enough information for us to share in the experience. And we also want to take her literally when she says things. And if they're symbolic, we then add that to, but don't dismiss the literal meaning. همه هستی من آیه تاریک است. What's our first impression of the word آیه? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear آیه?
It's a sacred text.
Religious reference.
Good. It is God's words to humankind. It's ayat asmani. And are they poetic? Are they musical? Have you ever listened to Quran recitation? Go online and do it sometime. In terms of rhythm, there's nothing different in Quran recitation in comparison with verse that's outside of religion. Now, as you know, in Islam, experts hesitate to call Quran poetic because there's a suspicion in Greek philosophy and in Islam of poetry, because poetry can make things that are not true seem to be true. And poetry, according to some people, can make people who are strong weaker because it plays on their emotions. I mean, this is a view. And the Quran has a chapter called Sha'iran, has a chapter on poets, which describes a traditional view in that part of the world, not just in Islam, that some people had about poetry. In any case, she is saying that her whole life is verses. But instead of being Asmani, they're darker verses. They're down-to-earth verses. If we take that literally, what kind of a person is it whose whole life is ayat? What do they do for a living?
Like a prophet?
Well, remember, the prophet kind of communicates the verses.
آخونده شد.
There's the prophet is the one who gets inspired and gives the verses, but the creator is the one who has the verses.
God.
And for the creator, all time being at the same time, there's no prophecy involved. The creator knows ahead of time. A person whose whole life is involved with verses does what for a living?
Oh, Ghazal mentioned poet.
A
right?
poet. It's a poet. And do we think of poets as being creators? Sure. That is, before the poem comes into existence, whatever the raw material was, it's not unlike the mud or the dirt or whatever it is that in physical terms God created out of. The poet brings something into existence that didn't exist before. So she is literally saying in an imaginative way that her whole life is poetry. که تو را در خود تکرار کنان به سحرگاه شکفتنها, and she reads, I think, شگفتنها instead of شکفتنها, و رستنهای ابدی خواهد برد. Who's the Torah? Who's the direct address?
Ibrahim.
That is, I'm saying we're imagining an autobiographical context. We don't end up having to think that way, but let's say Ibrahim Golistan, or let's say any you she's talking to. How is it possibly true that Forugh in this poem can make that statement saying, I'm talking about you, and I'm going to introduce you to blossomings and growth that's eternal? How is that possible? Remember, poets, there's a world of imagination and art, but poets don't tell lies. Poets don't tell untruths. You just have to figure out where the context is in which what they're saying is true. Here we are I'm in Austin, Texas. You are other places. 2021, and we're reading this poem. That's pretty good. That is from 1959 to 2021. This poem has more readers today than it had then. Is there a chance that this poem will always be somewhere in a library, on a bookshelf, with somebody reading it until the end of time? Is that a possibility?
بله.
It's not an exaggeration.
Mm-mm.
So she is saying that her whole life is the poetry business, and what can she do? Like the creator with Ayata Asamani, her Ayata Zamini can cause the you to live forever. And of course, as a poet, she's going to live forever in the poem. Man dar in aye to ra ah keshidam. How is this literally true? How do you say a poem? Do you say a poem with the air coming in or going out?
Going out.
Going out. We've got all these letters that you can't say unless you have air. P, for example, you got to have air coming out, or you're going to say B. Well, if she has the content that's as one of you said, sad or nostalgic or sort of regretful or not optimistic, what's one of the reasons why that we sigh? We sigh when we're in that kind of a mood. Now, I'm doing something different from what I've done with other poems, because this, I've said all poems, we're reading them in vacuo, by themselves, and as sui generis, as unique to themselves. This is a poem of a poet's perceptions of the meaning of her life, which means the music of the poem is going to come somewhere else, or the warp and weft of the poem is going to come somewhere else with, in comparison with an object or an event. It's going to be complicated, multifaceted, and it's going to be her voice, the same throughout, that's going to pull things together. But it might not, her speaking voice might not have the regularity of lengths of lines, the regularity of rhyme scheme, or the quickly discernible regularity of meter of other texts. So that's why we're kind of parsing this poem. First, we have to, in other poems, we didn't have to do this. First, we have to make certain that what she's saying is absolutely, literally true in the world of the reality of art. So she's breathing out in a nostalgic, sad way the subject of the poem, which at this point is is you. I think it's a wonderful line. Usually, keshidan is fela lazem, is an intransitive verb. I sighed. We say I sighed a sigh, but generally we don't sigh things. Well, she makes it a transitive, active verb, and she's not exaggerating. Man dar in aye to ra be daracht و آب و آتش پیوند زدم. In this aye zamini, earth, air, fire, and water. I don't know what you call them in Persian, or the primordial elements, we call them. Do you say anasir al-ghazin or some such thing? That is, in medieval notions, there was a sense that there were four kind of primary substances: earth, air, fire, and water. What is she doing here? She's saying that she's going to make to as immortal as the constituent elements of the world. Or I can't see your faces, so I don't know if you're buying what I'm selling or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. We also have تکرار کنان and then من در این آیه. If we had the time, and you can do this, go through the whole poem and with a magic marker, mark everything that's a repetition of something before it. And when you finish it, most of the poem will be a magic marker. سهم من این است. زندگی شاید. That is, it has that same quality of creating music out of anaphora and repetition in general. Okay, let's go to the text that starts on page 5 and page 6, page 8, 5.8. Can any of us define life? Zendagi shayad. Can any of us define life? Yes or no? Can we all can any of us define life?
Yeah.
Can something happen in life tomorrow that hasn't happened already?
حتما.
That means we can't define life. That's why definitions of poetry don't work. Because when Aristotle defined tragedy, he was saying, here's what the poets have done to this point in tragedy. But he didn't anticipate Shakespeare or Neil Simon or anybody else, Tennessee Williams or anybody else. So in the case of life, we don't know everything about life in the past. Some people didn't leave records. And we don't know what life is going to be like in the future. I mean, my question was not a gotcha question. It was just, we have to appreciate that we cannot define life satisfactorily. If we're religious people, we can define it in teleological terms. Our belief system would say, here's where we came from, here's what we're doing here, and here's where we're going to go. But I'm talking about the world here, which apparently doesn't have God as its center. Remember, it's modern. That is, she may be a believer, but that's not what's going to motivate her to mull things over. So what do you do when you can't define something, but you want to define something? You say, oh, Baskin and Robbins has all the flavors, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, and coffee. That's not all the flavors. They have 32. You don't know all 32. And maybe they have more than 32. But what a poet, an artist will do, will give you different kinds of pieces of life to give you the impression that they've actually defined it. So زندگی شاید یک خیابان دراز است که هر روز زنی با زنبیلی از آن می‌گذرد. That's every day. I imagine that. Yeah, a lot of life is like that. Shopping, doing daily chores. شاید زندگی شاید ریسمانی است که مردی با آن خود را از شاخه می‌آویزد. Very different, kind of startling in comparison. But yes, people destroy other people and they destroy themselves. And زندگی شاید تفلیس که از مدرسه برمیگردد. So we're going to have 5 or 6 possibilities of what life is about, and we get the feeling that life is defined. But it's an artist doing the defining. We get tricked, so to speak, as we kind of believe it. زندگی شاید افروختن سیگاری باشد در فاصله رخناک دو هماغوشی. This line, was this line in the reading? I don't think it was. Forugh, when she was on radio and recited this poem, she leaves out that line. The censors made her leave out that line. زندگی شاید افروختن سیگاری باشد در فاصله رخناک دو هماغوشی یا عبور گیج رهگذری. I like this one too. که کلاه از سر برمی دارد و به یک رهگذر دیگر با لبخندی بی‌معنی میگوید صبح بخیر. I kind of like this. Use more lines for this than for the others, but it is interesting. That is, people, when they, in the old days, man would walk by a woman on the street, would tip his hat. Nowadays, in American culture, if you walk by an African American on a city street and you're just the two people there, for sure they're going to say hello. It's still part of their culture. African American conferences that I've been to, it begins with the person who's giving the speech saying, "Good morning, everybody. Hello, how are you?" And everybody in the audience says, "Good morning to you." And there's kind of a half a minute of people behaving in a group in that particular way. Zendegi Shahid, but now, what has she done? She's gone from things that were far away that you could observe to things closer. Zendegi Shahid, on lahze masdudis ke negah man dar nini chashman to khud ra viran misazad. Can you lose yourself in somebody else's eyes? Yes, as if you no longer are you, as if the eyes are not a mirror, the eyes kind of absorb you. و در این هستید و زندگی شاید در این هستی باشد که من آن را با ادراک ما و با دریافت و ظلمت خواهم آمیخت. Forugh glossed this with Karim Amami, whose translation is here. They worked on this translation together in 1963. In her view, and I remember in Edrak Ma, when we have an F-all verbal noun, which is a very active, intensive noun, the noun that comes after it can either be the subject of the noun or the object of the noun. This can be subjective genitive, objective genitive. It can either be ما درک میکند or ما را درک میکنیم. Forugh says it's the moon and the darkness which have perceptions, which are involved in edrak and dariyaf. That's interesting. It means they mix with what the moon perceives, what nature perceives, and what darkness perceives. My whole life is this. I'm a poet. I'm in the immortalizing business. Life itself can be these things. Now if there's a tarapud here, if there's a warp and weft here, it's going to be the associations caused by her perceptions, not other sorts of structural things that we've seen in other poems. Remember did we do the poem which had, maybe it's in this poem, where a canary's song is the size of a window, or the window is the size of the canary song outside. Darotari, why is she in a room by herself? Darotari ke be andaze yek tanhایی است، دل من که به اندازه یک عشق است، به بهانه‌های ساده خوشبختی خود می‌نگرد. Is bahane in English? Often enough, I think of bahane as a pretext. But bahane can be an actual excuse or reason, right? I mean, toji kardan isn't explaining away. It can be an actual explanation. But it has that other quality to it. Bahane is something you use to explain something and might not be accurate. But anyway, so you have to decide about this. That is, she can give as reasons or excuses or pretexts, and you can decide how far you want to load it to the negative side. به بهانه‌های ساده خوشبختی خود می‌نگرد. به زوال زیبای گل‌ها در گلدان. What's pleasing or happy about flowers withering in a flower pot? See, if we were all together, we'd be answering all these questions as a group. I just can't do it. Don't know how to do it on Zoom.
I feel like I feel a lot of acceptance in this poem. It's like she's aware that there's a sky, but out there, but a curtain is going to cover it. Or the canary can sing a lot bigger, but chooses to sing as big as the allowance. Or
Why is she in a room? Why is she in a room?
I think she's chosen to be to in that place because she's so in love. The love is so it brings her contentment.
My
wife,
my favorite place in the world. My favorite place in the world is Maine, rural Maine, a particular village. My wife goes to Maine every 3 or 4 years for 1 week, and that's it, because she says there are no people, and the people don't say much anyway. That is, she chooses not to be in Maine.
Mm.
Who would choose to be alone in a room and looking out at the rest of the world? There couldn't be an answer to this question, but we're going to have to decide on the basis of what's in the text if this is a choice, so to speak, or if this is a circumstance of her life. She's in love with a guy who being autobiographical. I'm not saying we have to do this, but if she's in love with a guy who goes home at night, or is in love with a guy who works on an oil derrick and only comes home every 3 weeks, what's she going to do? She's really in love when the guy's away. She's just going to wait somehow. She's not going to be energetic and vital in the way she is when he's with her. But in any case, let's get back to the flower. When was she happy about the flower? When somebody brought the flower in the flower pot to her, which means she can say, I'm happy because I got it, even if the flowers are wilted. Now, why can I say that with a certain kind of definiteness? Because I've thought about all the possibilities. That is, it reminds her of something, and the something was beautiful, the act was beautiful, the flowers were beautiful. But she can still say she's happy because she got them, even though she didn't get one today. And Ben Nahalike, and another of my Bahanai Sade Khoshbakhti has to do with Nahalike To Dar Bakhshe Khanamun Kashtei. It is a biographical fact that Golestan planted a couple of saplings in her yard. It's just something we all know. I'm not saying do it biographically. She may be having that experience and is translating it into the world of art, not wanting us to think of Forugh, the person, wanting us to think of this speaker. But if somebody I loved planted a tree, although I can't imagine Soraya ever planting a tree, that'd be the world of fiction. I don't plant trees either. But if somebody I love planted a tree, wouldn't I, every time I saw the tree, have a positive feeling? But would I prefer the tree to the person? Of course, I prefer the person. And the tree might make me a little bit unhappy that the person is there and just the tree is. And a pretext of my happiness is I wish I were flying in the sky with them. I wish I were with my lover or beloved on a picnic when birds were singing, but it is a reason to be happy to hear at least this much of the sound of the birds. At the same time, however, the speaker says, my real lot in life is to become connected to memories. سهم من گردش حزن‌آلودی در باغ خاطره هاست و در اندوه صدایی جان دادن که به من میگوید دستهایت را دوست می‌دارم. That is, if we let this poem build up its effect piece by piece in us, rather than thinking about what overall we might imagine, we're not going to get depressed. We're going to find that her situation is a factor in creativity, and her producing this poem may in fact be a satisfying sort of thing, but it is not unlike the Hafezian speaker who is happy to be sad, who is happy to be in love, but the love is going to be unrequited. So I'm going to plant, line 40, I'm going to plant my hands in the garden the way kids do. Sabz khoham shud, midonam, midonam, midonam. Anybody know a famous example in Persian literature of somebody who planted herself? Zanan Beduna Mardane Shahnush Parsipur, the story of 5 women who have various lives in Tehran, and they end up at a place that one of them, who has some money, buys in Karaj, a garden environment, and allows these women to come there. 2 of them have been raped. They all have different stories of male society oppressing them. And one of them has always had a dream of planting herself as a tree. And when she gets there, the owner of the house, which has plenty of rooms, actually says, okay, I'm not going to object to this. It might be a draw for the house. People are going to come and go see this woman who's planted herself as a tree. Maybe when I sell it, it'll be, she's not a bad person, this I think her name is, who owns the house. Anyway, the woman plants herself. And after a while, she has seeds, and the seeds spread, and they go all over the world, and they're going to turn into other kinds of creatures. Although the narrator says, however, it's going to take generations before this woman who's planted herself into as a tree will actually turn again into a tree, that is the trees of her descendants. In any case, it seemed like, and when you read it, it seemed like a natural thing for somebody who didn't want physicality with a man, who didn't want to be in ordinary situations, but felt fruitful, felt that she could reproduce, so to speak, to have this sort of dream. However, I remember a couple of writers, Ahmad Shamlu being one of them, said, what the hell is this book all about? Here these women are talking about virginity in the book, and one of them plants herself as a tree. Who can read a book like that? And remember, he's the author of Padiyah. And this is not even though it's fiction, there's a kind of world of the reality of art in it. و پرستوها در گودی انگشتان جوهریم. Why are her fingers johari?
Writing?
مرتب می نویسه.
From writing.
She's in school. Yes, she's writing, but it's the old-fashioned ink well and pen sort of thing. Now, I grew up in that system. I never got ink on my hands. I was kind of careful. But if I were kind of an average kid, certainly I didn't get ink on my hands when I used fountain pens as a grown-up. But she's kind of suggesting that she's now gone back to that age. And the age she's in now is the age of childhood, where you have these fantastical dreams. تو خواهند گذاشت گوشواری به دو گوشم میآویزم از دو گیلاس سرخ همزاد. We've talked about that. و به ناخن‌هایم برگ گل کوکب میچسبانم. We have to let images do their work in literal terms. This is why we reached the conclusion early on with respect to کسی که مثل هیچ کس نیست, that the speaker is not Forugh. The speaker is that 10-year-old South Tehran, south of the railroad station girl who has that kind of life. Smart people, smart readers. One person did a master's thesis in literature saying that he was following Forugh autobiography in Kesi Ke Mesl Hich Kes Nist. There's assumed it was Forugh. Now we're doing the opposite here. We're tempted to think Forugh because the first thing she says in the poem, that is, my whole life is poetry. Then she goes on, Kuche has ke dar onja. Do you realize that the complexity of the poem gets unraveled? It becomes very straightforward once you imagine the exact progression of what's going on here. My life, the life, my lot in life. I've got a lot of time on my hands that I deal with memories. I go back to childhood. And now as a teenager, کوچه هست که در اونجا پسرانی که به من عاشق بودن هنوز با همون موهای درهم و گردنهای باریک و پاهای لاغر. That was me when I was 16, standing in a particular place. به تباسم‌های معصوم و دخترکی می اندیشند که یک شب او را باد با خود برد. What happened? How did the wind take her away one night?
Got married?
Got married. You all are too young to remember these days, but there were days where young guys in a neighborhood would suddenly stop seeing the girl they were interested in from a distance. She just wasn't around anymore. She got married and left. She says they're still there. How is that true? Because if she goes down the same street, it doesn't happen anymore, but 20 or 30 years after the era in which in the afternoon, if we played ball for a little while, we'd go to the neighborhood drugstore and kind of hang out, have a Coke and talk and what have you. Well, that went on for 30 years. So the same kind of people as we were in the late 1950s were still there in the 70s, not exactly the same people. So what she's saying is, I've been back to such places. And the same boys are kind of waiting for somebody like me, but I was taken away one night. The wind took me away one night. کوچه‌ای هست که قلب من آن را از محل کودکیم دزدیده است. That is, I've taken away from that place. I have it with me, memories. And here we get to the philosophical point about her perception. سفر حجمی در خط زمان. Imagine a straight line. And imagine the straight line has a point in it which is not any wider than the straight line. But it is a volume. It's a thing. It's a little circle that maybe you can't see it in the line, but say the line is composed of a lot of them. سفر حجمی در خط زمان به حجمی خط خشک زمان را آبستن کردن. And with its own volume, it impregnates, it makes pregnant the straight line, which looks like it just has two dimensions. Hajmi as tasviri aga, as an aware image, ke z mehmani yek ayane barmigardad. Yani, I know I make this half joke. Women go into the bathroom in the morning, look at the mirror to see what's the matter. Men go to the bathroom, look in the mirror to see if everything's okay, and then move on. But Sylvia Plath and Fadok Saad go to the mirror to find out who they are and what it is that's in them that can be meaningful. And let's make a giant leap to Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. God creates out of love and a creative impulse out of the so-called nothing, which means there's some of God in every human being. So when a mystic falls in love with another human being, that mystic has gotten to the point where he or she can see some of God in that other human being. Well, there's nothing to keep us human beings from going to the mirror. And if we've really disabused ourselves of the unimportant things in life, we're going to see something essential there. We may see some of what God made us humans with. And it would be like being at a party, being in that situation. What is that specific something that we find? This is the suggestiveness of poetry. That is, it's not a problem if something strikes us as deep, but we can't measure the depth, or we can't give it a shape. و بدین سان است که کسی میمیرد و کسی میماند. So has she died in her own terms?
No,
Why not?
because of what she left after herself. It's
Because of her,
always
very good.
her work.
That is Tanos Sadoskimi Monad. She's left her poems. I don't know if she knew this at this time, but that's in effect. And now let's go back to Ayeh. Ayeh comes from God. Even Ayeh Zamini, the spirituality that causes somebody to be creative, that may also have the same origin. It's we're the nay that's been separated from the Nayastan. Well, it still means we have whatever was in the Nayastan, which is a symbol for divinity. Don't say amen here. Some neighbor might hear us being overly religious. But بدین سان است که کسی میمیرد و کسی میماند. هیچ صیادی در جوی حقیری که به گودالی میریزد مواردی صید نخواهد کرد. Everything about this is, it's aphoristic, it's epigrammatic, it's pithy, but look at what she does. Just a little touch, and it's throughout the poem these touches. Yaya nakare, the unstressed ease, emphasize them. هیچ صیادی در جوی حقیری که به گودالی میریزد مواردی صید نخواهد کرد. صیاد، حقیر، گودال، موارد. That is, whether she thought about this or not, it's her business. That is, she's a wordsmith. She knows it. And then we get to that last stanza, which we've sort of glossed, where I guess to achieve aesthetic distance, and she's done a good job in the poem. She's not gotten sentimental at all. That is her craft. Remember, we talked about the problem of aesthetic distance in Surud Pekar and B'Chaharam. That is, her emotional investment in the injustices that women face cause her to be direct in an indictment and not to communicate an experience, but to communicate a thesis, which is okay in rhetorical terms, but doesn't work so well as art. So here, there was a chance that at the very end, she could kind of go personally overboard. So what does she do? She uses a metaphor for herself. So there's one remove between what strong feelings she has here and the art she wants to communicate. So I think lost in this way, the text kind of reveals itself. The issue is, do we want it to be autobiographical? Do we need it to be autobiographical? I kind of like knowing the autobiographical stuff when I reread the poem. But in each case, I could say, let's suppose somebody brought her some flowers. Let's suppose somebody planted a tree in her yard. Let's suppose the toe, who disappears after line 30 or thereabouts, let's suppose she's talking about a beloved and we don't care who. And let's suppose at the end, for some reason, she comes alive with kisses, and for some reason, he isn't there at the end of the evening, or there's one other possibility. They fall asleep. And so in a sense, and isn't sleep kind of a temporary death, so to speak? That is, let's say we don't have a dream, we don't have any consciousness. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's a possibility as well. That is, when you fall asleep, when you're awake, you realize when you fall asleep, you don't have the proximity of the lover or the beloved. When you wake up, you do. Okay, we have some time left. How about impressions that add to or are distinct from what I've done in this explication? We can say this is her most important poem in some regards. It's a poem which, if we had to use one poem to say, this is who she was as a poet and how it was on a typical day she perceived life, it's going to go down as one of the 10 or so most enduring poems of her generation. Anybody with some different or further thoughts?
من میخواستم یه نتیجه رو که خودم گرفتم از این شعر.
بفهمید.
میوت کردی فرم.
میوت کردم خودم. اینجا فروغ به نظر من یکی از قشنگی این شعر اینه یه جوری مسئله عشق رو و عاشق و معشوق و درد جدا بودن از معشوق رو هم اون درد رو توصیف کرده و هم اون جنبه‌های مثبتی رو که میتونه در عین حال ارتباطش با معشوق باشه، در این حالی که با فاصله فیزیکی از معشوق جدا هست، ولی اون درد رو تسکین میده با شواهدی که در دور و برش هست و اون ارتباط رو برقرار میکنه. در واقع یه جورایی اینجا مثلا در کل یه مسئله عرفانی رو مطرح میکنه که ما موقعی که از آگاه باشیم به اون رابطمون با کل هستی و با حالا اسمش رو هر چی که میخوایم بذاریم، خدا هست، معشوق هست یا اسپریت هست یا هر چیزی دیگه ای، موقعی که ما کاملا خودمون رو کات کنیم و هیچ ساینی نبینیم دور و برمون که اون ارتباط وجود داره، خیلی دردناکتر میشه ورسس اینی که موقعی که ما اون شواهد رو میبینیم و اون ارتباط همچنان در وجود ما جریان داره و یه جورایی با هم یکی میشیم. نمیدونم، من این حس رو از این شعر گرفتم. مرسی از این.
I wish we had a word other than Erfan to describe the intensity of connectedness between somebody and art, somebody and nature, somebody and other people, and the last one, which is Erfan, somebody and God. That is what you're describing, I agree with, but I'm tempted to say that her world may be defined the meaning that some people find in a spiritual relationship with God. She may find it in love,
right,
that intensity. She may find it in art. She may find it in nature. But I agree that it takes a person with a certain sensitivity and depth to actually look for it and to see that it's there. Remember, Hafez says famously, اونچه به پیمانه ما، اونچه اوریخ به پیمانه ما نوشیدیم. Mariam, what's the second verse?
خمر بشتست و باده ناب.
Yani Hafez himself, and for sure in his personal life he wasn't a mystic, but he has so-called mystical poetry. But there he's saying the important thing is whatever life has offered us, whatever creation offers us, whether it's Takastana hashed Gerd with 11% alcoholic content, it's wine, or mystical wine, people who are really alive are going to use it. Well, Farugh for sure from the beginning has been that sort of person. When we get to this poem, she suggests that she realizes that love is everything, which she has been searching for all along, But she also recognizes that, and I'm repeating myself, that love, even if it has moments of sadness, is in fact better than not being loved, and in her case, inspires her art, which creates another kind of immortality for her as well as for her lover in art. I mean, in English, of course, Persian as well, we distinguish between spirituality and religiosity. I just wish there was a good word to describe spirituality when it doesn't have to do with the literal world of the spirit, but has to do with how we, nature poets, or Wordsworth is like this. People talk about William Wordsworth as being a kind of aref, as being a mystic. He had those feelings that mystics have, but he recognized, and he thought that God inhered in nature around him, but he had his feet planted in this world, and the beauties of nature were physical as well as whatever else he found in them.
ببخشید من یه سوال دارم راجع به این قسمتی که میگه زندگی شاید آن لحظه مسدودی است که نگاه من در نینی چشمان تو خود را ویران میسازد و بعد ادامه میده که من آن را با ادراک ماه و دریافت ظلمت خواهم آمیخت. این بخش چند تا واژه هست که یه جوری این تیکه رو بر من یه خورده گیج کننده میکنه. یکی مسدود، بعد میگه ماه، ادراک ماه و دریافت ظلمت. ماه روشناییشو داره از خورشید میگیره و یه جوری من برداشتم اینه که زندگی فروغ یا این کسی که این شعر رو داره توصیف میکنه اینه که روشناییشو داره از اون عشق میگیره، اون عشقی که تابیده و رفلکس شده و این رو روشن کرده، ولی در این حال این لحظه مسدودیه. شاید به خاطر اینکه روشنایی از درون نیست، نمیدونم، یه جوری گیج کننده است این دیگه.
That is, you think masdud is a negative adjective?
بله.
زندگی شاید آن لحظه مسدودی است.
مسدود یه جوری مثل dead end میمونه تو ذهن من که این چرا لحظه ویران شدن در عشق باید مسدود باشه؟ میتونه یک rupture، لحظه همون که میگه تولد
فرخزاد و امامی اونو ترجمه کرده enclosed moment. They're seeing it as something that's been bounded and become separate from the rest of things, not that it has limited them. The way two people can be, you can be in a crowded restaurant if you're really engaged in a conversation or with your lover or beloved. It's just the other people are just kind of noise in the background. That is, you've created that enclosed space.
Can I add something? Is maybe شاید منظورش این بوده که انقدر فوکسش روی معشوقش بوده که کاملا جدا شده دیگه، بک‌گراند براش بک‌گراند نویز رو خاموش کرده در واقع، یعنی اون تمرکز رو روی اون
بله نظر بنده همینه. But at the same time she has the capacity or wants to be able to connect her feelings with what the moon is perceiving and what the night is perceiving. And the moon and the night perceive these two people in the enclosed moment, and she wants to be party to that perception, which is distinct from her saying that one of the things she does is she perceives the moon and she perceives the night. In that sense, even though it's an enclosed moment, it gets to be as big as the night and the moon if she can share in their perception, their impression, the night and the moon, and the night and the moon have a perspective that is higher up or broader than or deeper than her own sense of her looking at her beloved, causing her to have herself destroyed in that moment. At the same time as she's having that feeling, if she shares in what the moon and the night are doing, she will have a sense of what the significance of herself and her beloved is outside of herself. In a very small way, she did a similar thing with Joft. Instead of having herself in the poem, in which she might not recognize the two lonelinesses and the two hearts, even though she felt that way, her speaker becomes third person and omniscient. And we now are observing in the mind's eye two other people. She could have had the experience, but now it gets a little bit broader because she's outside and kind of looking at it. But again, as you know, is my habit in these cases, I don't push the meaning to the point where if it doesn't work out the way something in algebra works out or something in logic works out, I'm going to be frustrated. I can kind of let it go at a certain point. Maybe a compromise for position would say that mastud budane, that moment, is temporary, because if she will become party to the moon and the darkness's perceptions and impressions, she will have gotten beyond the sad, had gotten beyond the dammed up, the separated area. In there, Karim Amami wrote an article in a journal which I edited, describing the process he and Forugh went through in coming up with the translation. Her English wasn't that good. He was a good translator. But they talked about this, and there's some ambiguity in his explanation as well. Remember, Forugh might have not have known what she was talking about. That is, she may have only gotten to a certain point in her sense of what's going on here. And one of the reasons for that is, getting back to our initial conversations, is she herself is communicating experience. And communicating experience is not being a sociologist or a biologist or a psychologist or a historian or a political scientist or a family expert or what have you. It's the experience to the point where it resonates with her, the creative side of her, which is being a poet. But I think that's a very good observation. I think this is the one passage in the poem, as well as the metaphor in the Paddy Kuchik, where there's some linguistic ambiguity of how we're to take it, but not troubling. It's just we have to let it go, or to enjoy the poem.
ببخشید من یه ذره پازیتیو هم میبینم که با توضیحاتی که شما دادین، ادامه اون توضیحات، این که شما اون لحظه مسدود که همینجور که توضیح دادین یه چیز نقطه کوتاهی ممکنه باشه، من وقتی که اون بیت آخرش با ماه و ظلمت وصلش میکنه، یعنی داره میگه که البته شاید رو میگه، ولی داره میگه که من همینجوری خوشم و یاد گرفتم که با ماه و ظلمت در اون حس زندگی کنم. شاید.
Or I have the feeling or the desire to be able to see what's going on the way darkness can see, or see what's going on the way the moon can see. Whereas I'm usually more limited than that. I don't know the answer to the question.
May I say something about this?
Sure.
Yeah, I think که نگاه من در نینی چشمان تو خود را ویران میسازد. It's like she is experiencing a sense of selflessness, like being in a trance situation. And to me, that toe that Ibrahim Golestan or whoever she is talking about is like a muse to connecting her to a new birth, a new life in the realm of poetry. So it's not just about love, it's about having someone as a muse in her life, which through that person, through that muse, Frough herself and her poetry became immortal. And when she's talking about that wilting flowers, to me it means that she knows that that love is mortal, that love is fani, but she accepted that and she's content with that because they are going to be immortal, all of them, you know, like a package. The poet, the poem, the lover, or the muse, you know. So I read this poem like that. There is a very deep sorrow or sadness in the poem, but there are some hope in it too, like Sabz Khaham Shud.
Yes, but remember, Sabz Khaham Shud is about childhood. It's not about now. That is, it's a child who's saying, I'm going to become great. No, it is about the past. It's about what she said to herself in the past. There's those 3 or 4 sections. I don't think there's any way of getting around it. Those are the memories she had. When she was a kid, she would say, I'm going to grow green. I'm going to go grow green. I mean, because she said, I'm going downstairs into memories. And then she gives memories and ends up with the boys who are the same age. I'm tempted to say, if she wanted to reach that, if she wanted to clearly imply optimism, she might have done a little bit more than she did.
It's not.
Poets don't hide stuff. Poets want to have all the stuff that's necessary to communicate what they have on their minds and in their hearts. They want it to get on paper. But literally, I'm not a poet, but I wrote a poem one time in which I talk about meeting a girl on the beach, seeing her for the first time. I said, I walked to the beach, looked at the ocean, and then I saw her eyes and I realized 2 things could cause me to drown today. Okay. And we talk about losing yourself or drowning in someone's eyes. That could be enough for us to have an experience of the state she's in. She pursues it, however, she broadens it. One using mastud, meaning it was a situation where, as a couple of you have suggested, where nothing else seemed to be alive or matter at that moment. And then she has this business about the moon, which is above, darkness, which is all over, and darkness knows stuff, and the moon knows stuff. And my feelings, I'd like to share in that. What does that mean? I don't know.
آقای دکتر، منم یه چیزی بگم.
خواهش میکنم.
خب من هیچ یعنی علامت سوالی تو این بند نمیبینم. خب مثلا ما میگیم که این مسدود رو که الان غزل سوال کرد چرا، مثلا ما میگیم که در چشم معشوق غرق شدم. خب غرق شدن به نوبه خود یه چیز منفیه دیگه، درست کلمه منفی میتونه باشه، ولی یه چیز ولی وقتی میگیم در چشم معشوق غرق شدم این کاملا مثبته. بنابراین اینجا مسدود اینجا همون لحظه‌ایه که این دو نگاه با هم تلاقی میکنن. یک. دوم از این که اینجا ادراک و دریافت ترجمه فارسی ادراک دیگه، درسته؟ این ما معمولا توی فارسی اینجوری میگیم وقتی یک صورتی قشنگه میگیم مثل ماه میمونه، یعنی این استعاره‌ای که ما برای صورت زیبا معمولا به کار ببریم. این خیلی راحت میگه در اون لحظه‌ای که ما چشممون به هم نگاهمون به هم تلاقی کرد، انگار لحظه‌ای بودش که ماه داشت ظلمت رو روشن میکرد، یعنی اون چهره زیبای تو یا اون چشم‌های نافذ تو داشت وجود پر از تاریکی منو که خب تمام بندهای بالا داره راجع به رخوت و این چیز اینا صحبت میکنه، وجود من رو روشن کرد. و سلام.
What does mah symbolize in Persian poetry?
صورت زیبا. میگیم صورتش از زیبایی مثل ماهه.
Why does that metaphor work? What's the basis of the metaphor?
گردی خب معمولا در ایران از زمان مغول به بعد صورت گرد و سفید و اینا همیشه مظهر زیبایی بوده و به خاطر همین همیشه در تمام ادبیات ما سمبل، یعنی استعاره از صورت زیبا هستش. الان هم خیلی میگیم طرف مثل ماه میمونه، نه خیلی میگیم اینو. بنابراین میگم همین که در لحظه‌ای که من به چشمای تو خیره شدم اون نگاه تو مثل این بود که انگار وجود پر از ظلمت منو روشن کرد، مثل ماه که تاریکی رو روشن میکنه.
ببخشید ولی مگه آقای دکتر نگفتن که فروغ خارج به اصطلاح وارد مدرنیسم شده که فرم رو متفاوت از اون چیزی که در گذشته توصیف شده بیان کرده؟ اینجا هم یه سوال پیش میاد که آیا منظور فروغ اون چیزی بوده که از ماه توی شعرهای گذشته، من حالا اصطلاحش رو نمیدونم ولی مثل این که آقای دکتر چیزی که توضیح دادن، فروغ جز کسانی بوده که این فرم رو در واقع متفاوت از اون فرمی که در گذشته بیان شده مطرح کردن.
Again, I think if we wanted to go down that road, there would be some kind of implication here. And the question I asked about the moon in general was that I've never had the impression that Gerd Budan had anything to do with Mah Budane Kesi. The full moon in the sky is as beautiful as things get because it stands out and is unique in that particular environment, which means that what in Persian people call esteare or tashbih, most often in English, I'm not saying English is right, but most often in English is an analogy. The moon is to the sky at night what you are in the world around you. That's the perfection. Not that they're in Hallmark cards is going to start writing cards to Topoli Khanum or talk about size. I think it's perfection. And part of the perfection is you glow in human emotional terms the way the moon glows in the sky, which means there are parallels rather than just one point of comparison between two objects. That's one thing. But I also agree with the notion that when Forugh uses parts of the body and elements of nature, unless she adds something, there probably isn't much of a reason to put it in the environment of how vocabulary was used in the past. For that matter, if in a poem by Hafez, he uses a particular word that's been used elsewhere to have a particular connotation, I still want Hafez to establish the connotation in his poem. I read a poem the other day that somebody put online, a poem by Sa'di, in which the whole poem had all the stereotypical notions of moon, polo stick and a polo ball, and in 5 or 6 couplets. And if I hadn't studied Persian poetry, I wouldn't have known what the poem meant, what pictures were being asked. And I would say that Sa'di's poem is limited because the only people who can appreciate it are people who are in a court setting in the Middle Ages, or people who have acquired that knowledge later to appreciate all the things going on, because he doesn't make them come alive again. Hafez, in his successful poems, even if he's using stereotypical imagery, he makes the images come alive in the particular text. In the same way we've got heavenly wine and earthly wine, we've got heavenly beloveds and earthly beloveds. In fact, Khurram Shahi argues that most of Hafez's love poems are not mystical poems and not everyday love poems. They're literary poems. In other words, you've read all these poems that have saqi in them. Where does a saqi give wine to people? At parties. What kind of parties? Court parties. That means any poem by Hafez that has a saqi giving wine, you have to imagine the setting of the poem being a gathering with people. And then you have to imagine that the poem is being performed for those people who are enjoying it. That takes it out of the realm of anything Rumi does when he's being intimate and spiritual, or anything Forugh does when she's being intimate and personal. So I think a rule of thumb for us can be, in dealing with Forugh at any rate, is take her at her word, and if we're reminded of something else, see if there's something else in the poem that implies what we're reminded of. Otherwise, it's not necessary for Forugh to have answers to the problems of the universe in any particular poem, or even have answers to the problems in her own life. Let the other stuff go. Now, usually what happens is we come to a poem, the word love is used. We think of 30 things, and we should think of 30 things. By line 5, we're thinking of 20 things. By line 25, we're thinking of the one thing that she has in mind. Or if there's ambivalence, the 2 things that she deliberately or instinctively has in mind. Forugh kind of enjoyed this poem and been happy because she composed it. I don't find evidence in the poem. I'm not arguing this. I personally don't find evidence in the poem to suggest that this is the life she wanted. This is the life she has. And she has bahanay khoshbakhti in it. But that's a little bit different from doing what you want. Could she have done what she wanted had circumstances been different? Especially in the relationship with Goldston. Let me be biographical. Why didn't Goldston give her the deed to the house he built for her? My view is that that's taking a risk. If you don't make your significant other sign a prenuptial, at the very end, that person might not stay with you. And then if that person leaves you, at least in Texas, that person gets half. But if you own the deed to the house and the person doesn't have any income other than what you pay that person, is that more of an incentive for a person to stay? I'm not saying this is what was on his mind, but it is curious that he didn't buy the house. It is also curious that he didn't divorce his wife. I mean, people got divorced then, especially in that particular crowd. She was his first cousin. It was a match made in the heaven of Iranian culture. They had 2 children. Why wouldn't he take that risk if he was in love with Forugh? Why didn't Golestan offer anybody for 40 years any of the unpublished poems or letters or other information? He understood what she was as a poet, that she belonged to the world as a poet, that her poems needed as much information as possible for us to enjoy them more. So there are, her life was a tough life. She was, my impression is she had very happy moments, but perhaps to the point of not being short of clinical manic depressive, to the point of being happier lots on some days and then unhappy. There were weeks when she didn't show up to gatherings. And then there were times when she showed up all the time. That is, she had a mercurial personality that her close friends understood, and they treated her accordingly. Let me give an example that has nothing to do with anything, but when I see a public figure, and I never see that public figure just relaxing and laughing in a normal laugh, I think something is up. And for the first day when I saw Donald Trump in public life, I didn't see him smile in the kind of way you smile when you're just being you, or laugh when you're just being you. Forugh, when she was just being her, because she was being a woman, and she was, let's say, not aggressive, but she was standing her own ground and she wasn't supposed to, that caused negative reactions. On the case of political figures, if they're menfolk and they just act naturally, that could be a plus. But she was expected to wear certain kinds of masks. Just look in her poems. Where do you find a poem where she just kind of whistles as she walks, where she just has a day which is just a sunny day, not the most meaningful thing in the world, but just a regular sunny day? Her last big poem, Why Should I Stop? Everybody wants this. Everybody wants that. Why should I be like everybody? Why should I stop? Tanas Sadas Kemi Monad. Well, she got that right. Here we are thinking about enjoying that Sada. Sounds and a voice that remains. I just wonder if she had lived to middle age or beyond middle age, whether people would have relaxed around her, which would have allowed her to relax. That is, she'd stop being the other woman. Remember, those of you who didn't live in Iran during her era, the first thing that other women thought of, that is, the wives of the other people in the literary crowd, is if Forugh shows up at a party and I'm not there, what's going to happen to my man? Because they literally had these thoughts that she was, what do we say in American culture? They used to call it the woman who's the home wrecker. The second thing that happened, and this is even less savory, is that when Golestan started having a relationship with Forugh, I know of 4 other writers who immediately tried to find mistresses so they could have somebody too. Whether their relationship was fine with their wives or not, they want to be able to say, oh, yes, I have a mistress, a poet, a singer, a this or that. It's sad, but it's true.